Gender inequality at work. By most any measure you select on a societal level, it exists. Our guests today are expert in this situation and believe we have been coming at the solution from the wrong direction or directions. And today we'll talk about the path they suggest for changing it. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could be with us in the future live. And to do that on your favorite social channel, you can learn more about when those take place and how you can participate in that way by going to our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to do that. Today's episode is brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteambook.com. That's longdistanceteambook.com. And so now let me bring in our guests. There they are, sitting so close to each other. You'll see why they're okay about that in just a second. Our guests today are Andrea Kramer, also known as Andy, and Alton B. Harris, also known as Al. They are distinguished attorneys, married. See, that's why they're okay sitting so close to each other. And co-authors of, among other things, the new book, Beyond Bias, The Path to End Gender Inequality at Work. For decades, Andy and Al have tackled gender bias in the workplace through speaking, workshops, articles, blog posts, podcasts like this one, one-on-one counseling, and engagements with national and international business and professional organizations. They have appeared in the New York Times, Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, the Huffington Post, the Chicago Tribune, Fast Company, Cranes, and many other publications. They provide practical techniques that women, men, and organizations can use to prevent the gender stereotypes and biases that flow from them slowing down or derailing the careers of women. And with that, welcome to both of you. So glad you're here and excited to be spending a little time with you today.
Thank you so much, Kevin.
We're glad to be with you.
Well, I'm glad to have you. So we're good to go. So I'm going to start here. You're attorneys, you're married. We know that. How did you lead? What led you to this work, to thinking about the work of women at work and the gender inequalities?
Well, for me, when I got out of law school, I thought you just put your head down and you do great work, and that's all it takes. And started a tiny little law firm where they couldn't have cared if you were purple polka dotted. If you did a good job, everybody wanted you on their projects. And fast forward, I left there and went to a big firm and found that the stereotypes and the biases that people have about women, men, and leaders affected the way that they not only interacted with me, but interacted with the other women at work. And so when I was on our compensation committee, I found that there were many people who, women in particular, who would write about how they had been involved in the team and worked on the team, and the men who had been on her team talked about how they single-handedly had changed the world. And so I realized that the stereotypes and the biases are not just men interacting with women, but women interacting with themselves and other women as well.
So they got you involved in this work, and we're certainly glad that you are involved in this work. So I think we would all agree that there are inequalities. But one of the things I found interesting in the book at the start is you sort of make the case, right? Even though I think we all can sort of say, yeah, it's there. Maybe what are a couple of statistics or a couple of facts that might make the case or remind us of how big of a gap we have?
Well, I think most people are familiar with the fact, because it gets publicized a lot, that there are very few women CEOs of major companies. I mean, that number has gone from about 4% up to about 6 or 7%. So it's been improving, but by and large, major organizations are run by men. But it goes well beyond that. What we know is that women and men enter professional career positions at about equal proportions. But from the very beginning, their first move up to manager, those percentages begin to change. So that when we get to the first manager position, something like 68% are men and the rest are women. And that begins to trickle off all the way up to the CEO level. But the statistic that I think is really most telling is that all publicly held companies have to report to the SEC what are described as their named executive officers. That is their CEO, CFO, and the next three highest paid employees. And if we look across all publicly held companies, the percentage of named executive officers who are women are just about 12%. 12% of the top leadership of all publicly held companies are women. Well, in our mind, that's a clear indication of gender inequality at work.
So we know we come into this conversation knowing that it's a serious challenge. But I'm 61 years old, and I've been hearing about this for most of my adult life and observing it in some ways for most of my adult life. My question would be this. Why is it still so pervasive from your perspective? Okay, like this isn't a new problem, right? We've been trying to work on it collectively, societally, for a long while. Why is the problem still so pervasive?
Well, let's put this in perspective. If we go all the way back, let's say to the early 50s, women, this problem really didn't come up because women really weren't in careers at all. So enter the women's movement, enter the feminine mystique, and lo and behold, beginning in the 60s, 70s, 80s, women make remarkable progress in moving up into careers. They virtually enter all previously male-dominated careers. When we get to the 90s, however, we seem to hit a brick wall. Something has happened. There's what we like to think about, there's a saturation point, maybe a men's tolerance point that's reached in which they just stop it. And it's really since the 90s that we've been working on trying to correct gender inequality.
And one of the points with respect to that is that the corporate America is putting billions of dollars in programs to try to eliminate bias. And what we found is that the anti-bias training programs are not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not helping. And so because of that, the training is not working. For example, if much of the training is, here's what stereotypes are, here's what biases are, don't be biased. Well, the problem is that don't be biased doesn't help us when we're talking about unconscious biases that we have. And so telling people don't be biased is not solving the problem. And so what we found and what we put together in the PATH program is that what happens is if you can get the bias out of an organization's policies, procedures, and practices, miraculously, you can get rid of bias, because we're never going to be able to wait until every senior leader is free of bias. That hasn't worked, and it's not going to work. And so what we need to do is we need to separate the decision-making process from the stereotypes and biases that people carry around with them at all times.
So I know that you're advocating for something other than training, which we're going to get to. I promise. We're going to talk about the path here in a little bit. For folks who are here, though, that have some training, is there anything that you would suggest to make the training that they have even marginally more effective? Any tips or ideas around that? I know that's not the whole solution, and we're going to get to the rest of it. But any thoughts about the training itself that you would make it better?
Sure. Well, I'll start with information is power. And so it's powerful to have information about stereotypes and biases. We're not suggesting that that's not worth having the discussion. It's just that you cannot stop there. And that one of the key issues that we found, and in fact, one of the key paths of the PATH program, is eliminating exclusionary behavior. And that's a key issue about training. To just say, don't be biased, isn't going to get us there. We really need to be giving people tips and ways that they can, when they see it, how they can call it out, how they can work to improve the inclusion and the welcomeness of their organizations. And so that's really a key part of what you can do today with your current training.
Let me add, I think that's all absolutely on point, but one of the things that I think that training can do a lot better is to make clear the essential similarities between women and men with respect to their capacities, commitments, and leadership abilities. That is, I think we focus too much on these negative stereotypes and not enough on making people consciously aware that there are no fundamental differences in ambition, in competence, in commitment between men and women who have entered the workplace. So that when we can recognize that there must be something wrong with the system, given the fact of this similarity, we're far more alert and ready to listen to alternative ways of behaving, of going about doing things.
So you're, so Al, you're kind of getting into what you guys call the 5 gender myths. You've hinted at them a little bit, but I'd love for you guys to lay them out for us. You again call them the 5 gender myths. There probably are more than that, but I think these 5 are really important for us to talk about. You want to get at those for us real quick?
Yeah, I got to look it up to be sure that I get them all in.
It wasn't meant to be a book report, but certainly okay. While they're doing that, we are talking to the authors of the book Beyond Bias, and really that's, Al, where you're going, is that,
yes, absolutely.
The myth is that there's a difference between women and men in terms of their competence, in terms of their ability to do certain things. That isn't necessarily.
See, I thought you were going to go to what are the biases that people have, which we both can fight over. But basically that somehow women are not interested in collaborating. They're not interested in that they have a weaker performance, a sense of lack of community.
Let me go through.
He's got them now. I've refreshed his recollection.
No, but we.
It's page 21 if you want help.
Let me first of all, one of the first myth is that women and men make different career choices. That in fact, women don't want the same level of career success. They're not willing to work as hard as men. Well, that just isn't true.
I'll go with it now, since Kevin has given me the Cliff Notes answer here. But women and men are fundamentally different in non-biological ways. That's the first myth.
It's a myth. That's not true, right? So she's going to state these as a myth, and then we're going to say
it's
so
not
bad,
true.
Right?
That women lack the ambition to handle intense competition. Again, we set out why that's not true. Women are not as self-confident as men. Again, that's not true. Women cannot deal with risks and danger. And we know that's not true as well. And the other myth, which is a big one, that women are caregivers, and therefore, if they're caregivers, they're not leaders. That's not true either. So there.
There you go. So there, the one that I think how do you like a myth? But the one that I like the most is that men and women don't have the same levels of self-confidence. You actually show some data in there that says, man, they map right on top of each other. And I think that when you step back and think about, the women, any of us, think about the women in our lives. That we know a lot of women very self-confident. We know a lot of men very not self-confident, right? Like, I think that when we really, it's like many myths. When we actually examine them, we say, well, maybe not really all that true. So I think that it's those myths, it's those biases that start to create where we've gotten, the point we've gotten to. And now I love the way you set this up, back to the 50s and the 60s, we didn't have this conversation because we didn't have women in a lot of the roles that they certainly are in now. There's another thing that government has tried to do, right? They've, in many cases, mandated training. Hey, we need to do training. Started with harassment training, diversity training, bias training, etc. The other thing they've done is they've created mandates. You also don't believe that mandates or disclosures are the right answers either. Why not?
Well, mandates make people out to be tokens. That is, when we mandate a certain percentage of women or minority groups or whatever it is in various positions, those people that are elevated into those positions have their capacities, abilities denigrated. They are viewed as there as a undeserved advantage, that in fact they are where they're been put into, not because they're good at it, but because they have particular social identities. And that is self-defeating in our view. We're not going to get to where we need to get in terms of gender equality through affirmative action. It's going to backfire. And therefore, we believe that what we need to emphasize is not pushing people forward, but opening doors so that there aren't artificial barriers to their advancement. And we think we can get there that way much more effectively.
I would agree. So now we sort of laid the groundwork. We've talked about why we have the problem. We've talked about some of the myths. We've talked about what we're doing that may not be working, and then things we've been doing for a long time. And you have identified, and I've hinted at it, and you've hinted at it, that you believe there's a path, there's a way that we can move, and it's PATH as an acronym, if you will. And so, okay. I don't know if you have to get the book back out here, Andy, but we're going to talk about the four. We're going to talk about the 4 parts of the path. And
I can do the 4, provided I don't have to tell you exactly the words that we have for the titles of the chapters. Because
how about if I put it right up on there? So
okay.
The P is prioritize elimination of exclusionary behavior. What do we mean? We're going to take each of these 4 and talk about them. I'm going to ask you some questions, but at a high level, what are these 4 things that we need to be doing that will have real success, as opposed to the things that haven't gotten us the traction that we'd like to get to solve this problem?
Well, we've started to nibble around the edges of this one. And basically, one of the key things is that some of the studies show that women and men, as Al said, start their careers with the same interest, desire, drive. And within a handful of years, it's been basically they've been ground down and they've lost a lot of it. And so one of the key issues is that we need to eliminate the exclusionary behavior because it gets in the way and prevents women and men from achieving their objectives. And so what we do in the prioritizing that is we talk about ways that we need to eliminate discretion. We need to give people permission to help each other, to go out of their way to support other people who are different from them.
By exclusionary behavior, we mean things like rudeness, incivility, not inviting people into various sorts of social events, being haughty, acting privileged, talking down, interrupting. Basic civility is lacking where there is exclusionary behavior. So women are treated and tell us over and over again that they are treated in ways that make them feel uncomfortable, unwelcome, and basically excluded from the participation in the heart and soul of their workplaces. We need to stop that. We need to find ways to make certain that everyone has a welcoming, engaging, fulfilling workplace experience. So that's number one in the path.
Yeah. So before we go past this one, the thing that strikes me about this, as I think about it, as I read in the book, is that this is very much a cultural piece, right? An organizational cultural piece.
Right.
And so some of you that are listening might say, hey, I don't think we have some of those behaviors, and you may not. But I would encourage you to think about that with the lens on it, as Al has just described, but to recognize that it's a cultural piece, right? Culture is the way we do things around here. And if that's the way we do things, that's a pervasive piece we have to fix before we can go on beyond the P in path. The A in path is to adopt discrimination-resistant methods for making personnel decisions. So give us some examples of that.
Well, where we think the primary discriminatory effect on women is in personnel decisions. And by personnel decisions, we made in hiring, in making assignments, in parceling out responsibilities, in compensation, and in promotion. Those are all personnel decisions. And by and large, organizations make those decisions in a discretionary way. By that, I mean, managers simply have an instinct. They think, oh, this person is ready. This person can handle this job. I like the way this person behaved. I like the working with this person. So what we mean by adopt bias-free methods of decision is finding methodologies for making these kinds of decisions that reduce or eliminate the possibility of bias creeping in. Now, we give 7 ways. I won't go through all of them, but there are 7 ways that those biases can be excluded from the decision. Let me give you just 2. One, there's a very well-known technique called blind auditions. We call it screening. We can screen the social identities of people under consideration from the decision makers, so that when we're deciding who to hire, when we're deciding who to promote, when we're deciding what to provide, what raises to, we can do that on a screen basis so that the gender, for example, of the person under consideration is not apparent to the decision makers. Another way to do this is to try to force people to make these decisions in a method that Daniel Kahneman, the Pulitzer Prize winning psychologist, calls slow thinking. We can force people to not make those decisions with their gut, not to make those decisions instinctively, not to make those decisions based on perceived likes or dislikes.
Go ahead.
And so, for example, we can make those decisions collaboratively. When we have to discuss a decision with someone else before we reach a final conclusion, we try our best to appear open, thoughtful, to give objective reasons, so that when we have to talk about it, justify it before we make it, we slow our thinking down. And when we slow our thinking down, we take bias out of the decision making.
We make it more concrete. We take the inferences out and we make those things happen. So we've talked about two parts of the path, the P and the A. The T is to treat inequality. This is, I think, the most fascinating of the four to me. It makes tremendous sense, but it might initially seem counterintuitive. It says to treat inequality in the home as a workplace problem.
Sure.
So
well, I'm going to set it up, and I'm going to let Al do the heavy lifting. We're not talking about somehow that organizations are going to be able to helicopter into homes and change the way homes operate. We're not talking about them being able to deal with those sorts of issues that come up when couples decide who's going to be driving the train and who's going to be managing other things. We're not talking about that at all. But what we are talking about is that in the workplace, when women and men are competing for the same sorts of positions, who are striving for the same leadership roles, that because of the inequality in the home, what happens is that men have a significant leg up and are able to advance in their careers in a way that women can't.
And that's
or that it's perceived that they can't, right?
Right.
But because women simply bear a much heavier responsibility in the home. Now, we don't think that that's the way it ought to be, but it is the way it is. So that women bear the great majority of childcare responsibility. They spend more time with childcare than the men do. They also spend more time on domestic tasks than men do. Well, when women spend more time at home than their male counterparts do, that means they have less time in the workplace than the men do. So that what we see from studies, and indeed a very fascinating new book on careers and families by a professor at Harvard, is that women start out spending about the same amount of hours in the workplace as men. As they spend more time and are likely to have more children, their hours in the workplace decline. So that after about 8 to 12 years out of the workplace, women are spending almost 10 hours a month less than men are.
So we're not going to be able to change that. But what we are proposing is that the organizations need to recognize with flexible policies and possibly doing some child care support, since our country is the only country in the OECD that doesn't have government supported child care and paternity leave. So we would like to put a little pressure on the organizations to try to level that playing field.
So to get to our last of the part of the path is the one that maybe some people would have thought of first, right, as they were listening to our conversation: to halt unequal performance reviews, career advice, and leadership opportunities. And I think this is probably the one that might be the clearest to everybody right off the bat. Anything in particular here that you want to highlight for us?
I will, because this is actually where we started, and I started many years ago on worrying about gender bias. The problem with performance reviews is that very often he's a go-getter and she's too aggressive, too assertive, and in your face. He's got a lot of projects that he's juggling. She has difficulty managing her schedule. And so the exact same behaviors are characterized totally differently depending on the lens of whether it's a man or a woman. The other part of it is that what we found in the studies support that men are encouraged to go for that next job, go for that promotion. You can do it, give it a try. And women are not given the same sorts of leadership advice, recommendations, career advancement opportunities. And so what happens is it creates a doorway that is is open for men, that is not, the skids aren't greased for the women in the same way.
So I have a question that people might be thinking about. You mentioned a second ago, Andy, about flexible work schedules, et cetera. So my question is, we've just lived through this thing called a pandemic. I know that we're talking about a challenge that's existed for a long time, and yet we went through this cataclysmic change for 3 years. Has the pandemic made this at all better or not from your perspective? Has it helped us or hurt us in this regard?
Well, actually, the studies show that women ended up doing all the work at home anyway. And the men who thought that they were, who answered studies, surveys saying that they were doing half the work, the same women were answering saying that they didn't do any of it. So I think that it has hurt in some ways, but I think it's helped in the possibility of understanding flexibility in a way that we didn't see before. So that now I think that there are opportunities for more flexible schedules that people 3-4 years ago would have said, well, that's just impossible.
Right.
It is
because now we've done it, right? Now we've done
exactly.
It made companies aware that they can do things that they would never have considered before. That is, the notion of flexibility 5 years ago, of the monumental proportions that we now have, just were inconceivable. But we know people that go into their office maybe one day a week. We know people that go, businesses that are increasingly saying, well, come in when you can, or come in 2 days a week, or we'd like to have these kinds of meeting schedules, but not on the weekend. So I think we've opened the possibility of change that we didn't have open before.
I would agree. And hopefully that's one way that we can help to get ourselves beyond the bias around gender inequality in the workplace. So now I have a couple of questions, sort of shifting gears on you all before we finish. A couple of final questions. One is, and the only thing I told you I was going to ask you, which is, what are you reading these days? You want to share with us what you're reading?
Well, one of the things is Simon Winchester's book on the professor and the madman, which is fabulous. And we're now hooked on him. And Al might tell you one of the other ones that we might be.
The Professor and the Madman, which we just finished, is about the creation of the Oxford English Dictionary, and is a fascinating recounting of the fact that there was, in fact, a madman who was a major contributor to that dictionary. We're now reading the same author's book, Krakatoa, which is about the 1883 volcanic eruption in what is now Indonesia, and the consequences. But beyond that, about the discovery of why we have volcanic eruptions, why we have earthquakes, about the whole science of plate tectonics and oceanic drift, continental drift. So that's what we, when we're not worried about gender bias and gender.
We're worried about volcanoes, apparently, but we're listening. We're reading Simon Winchester's work, and everybody will have those.
Everybody should definitely check him out.
We will have those linked in the show notes, as of course, along with Beyond Bias, the book from Andy and Al that we've been talking about. So before we go, where can we learn more? Where do you want to point people to learn more about the book, to learn more about your work? Where do you want to point people?
Well, the book and our other books are available on Amazon or any retailer that you want to make friends with, or even your corner bookstore. I'm sure they would be happy to get you a copy. on our website, andyandal.com. And the only trick there is that I spell my name Andy, A-N-D-I-E. So A-N-D-I-E and A-L.com. And sign up for our blog, sign up for our newsletters. We have posted there past articles, and we'd love to hear from you. So and we respond as soon as we get inquiries. So we'd be happy.
Andy, A-N-D-I-E, and al.com.
Bingo.
That's it.
So everybody, now a question for all of you who are listening, watching or listening. And the question is this. It's the question I ask you every single episode. Now what? You've had the chance to hear from these experts, passionate and knowledgeable about gender inequality at work. And the question is, what are you going to do as a result? What's something that you learned here that you can go apply in your workplace, in your day, in your mindset, that might make a difference for the folks around you? See, the thing is, this is a societal challenge, but it is solved one workplace, one leader, one team member at a time. So I hope that you will take that into account and you will think about that. I hope that this episode has informed you and challenged you, perhaps in ways you haven't had from us before. And I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll make sure that you come back in the future. You can always go to remarkablepodcast.com for all the show notes for all past episodes. And you can also go wherever it is that you are listening to this and subscribe, review, you know the drill. Wherever you're watching or listening, I hope that you'll continue to do that and be back with us next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.